Let's talk a little bit about what's going on in Libya. Lewis, you've been reading up about this, and of course, being half Iranian, I know that you keep a close eye on the pulse of the Middle East. What exactly is going on?
Well, I guess one of the many countries to
take a cue from Egypt.
Right. There's been massive protests, but I think from what I read this morning that the protesters took over the second largest city in the country.
That's right.
And I've got all sorts of fascinating updates here. For example, Libya's ambassadors at the UN are calling for the leader to step down.
Right.
I guess that 2 pilots have defected to Malta after basically refusing to gun down civilians.
But not everybody refused, I believe.
No, that's right. Fighter jets did open fire on the crowds.
And people were killed.
Yes.
This brings up an interesting question, which is, we can't say for a fact that the other Middle East protests taking place now have been inspired by what happened in Egypt. What we can say is that there is a general atmosphere that is developing there, which is certainly maybe making people think that this is as good a time as any. But what I have been thinking about is maybe what happened in Egypt has influenced some to think that it's going to go the exact same way anywhere else, and that the army is not going to come out and just start mowing people down. And that's not necessarily going to be the case, as we're seeing in Libya.
Right. I think Egypt, I guess, was an anomaly because I think in the vast majority of countries there will be military force, and we're seeing it here. I guess also the justice minister stepped down, citing excessive use of violence.
So we're really seeing a two-sided thing. We are seeing, number one, the military going above and beyond what we would hope to see and what we saw in Egypt. But at the same time, we are seeing actual officials saying, you know what, I disagree with this so severely that I'm out of here. So different than Egypt on both fronts, this brings us back to a discussion we had a couple of weeks ago, which is knowing that the situation in the U.S. is not one where we have had the same dictator in power for 30 years. Hypothetically, if a similar magnitude protest started here, would it be able to affect change the way that it appears to have done in Egypt? And we basically said, we don't know. I think that what would happen in the U.S. would be, I'm not saying mowing people down the way we're seeing in Libya, but I think that there would be less restraint on the part of the military than what we saw in Egypt.
Yeah. Well, I think there's really only 3 outcomes. Either you have relatively peaceful protests, or hell, maybe even violent protests, and there's a change, like in Egypt. Or the government military just completely shuts you down, kills many people, whole lockdown. Or I guess what could happen, which might still happen in Libya, is the military uses force. It gets a bit too much. The military starts refusing orders. Other leaders start leaving.
And you have de facto change.
And you have change, but not without many deaths.
And certainly, Lewis, being very, there are more than those 3 options. But with regard to the military force and how involved they are, I think you're right.
Well, what else could really happen here?
Yeah, no, I don't know what will happen. And my fear is just that individuals will be influenced by Egypt and assume that it will go the same way where they are. And they may have a far more, a very rude awakening, for lack of a better term.
Right. Not every country is the same as Egypt.